I'd like to welcome another presenter, another conversationalist into this. Durkhanai Ayubi, who's a writer and restaurateur. And Durkhanai, I'll just give people a little bit of background on you. So some of you from Adelaide, and I know there's some of you in this conversation, would be familiar with the Parwana restaurant. And Durkhanai is actually about to have a book published that blends recipes and stories from an Afghan kitchen. And I know kitchens have become a very big part of everybody's working life as well. But one of the things Durkhanai is involved in is a thing called Atlantic Fellows, which is a global network of leaders who are, I think, very much looking at what it is to be a leader in now and in the future, and how to encounter and reinterrogate the sorts of things that we want to talk about around dismantling that Brenton started to raise. And I know that you're a real global citizen, Durkhanai, and now back home with more time for reflection amidst all of the other unlearning. Though I'd love to hear a bit about what you have to say and your provocation as well, and any responses to that, and just the nature of trust. I want you to sort of address that a little, if you can. And Kristen, of course, you're welcome to join in whenever you wish. But over to you, Durkhanai.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Kristen. And it's really lovely to be here with all of you and the other speakers at a time which I think is quite a momentous one in our human story. I guess, well, I want to start with the theme. So the theme that I was asked to kind of reflect on was one of dismantling. And if we're talking about dismantling, I think it's interesting to ask, well, what are we dismantling? And for me, as somebody who is a refugee, a migrant, and as you mentioned, Matt, somebody who's involved with a global program that looks at inequity through different lenses, it's really interesting for me to think about where those social inequities come from. And I think what I came up with was this idea of boundaries. So if we're talking about dismantling, I think we're talking about dismantling boundaries. And for me, when you think about boundaries, we're thinking about the concept of power, because power sets boundaries. And I think that in our world today, we are largely ruled and regulated by a concept of power that is authoritarian and which kind of sets things up so we feel quite alienated from ourselves. And I think that's been like a really slow burning iterative process over generations and eras of human civilization. And if I bring it to the literature, it kind of reminds me of the work and the work of Joseph Campbell, who's a comparative methodologist and a historian. And, it's kind of helped me think about these things quite a bit, because his work is very extensive, but basically what he comes up with is this idea that humans derive their sense of social power and how they organize themselves and their concept of leadership based on where they see the greatest sense of mystery and awe. And his thesis is that from our infant state as hunter-gatherers, we kind of evolved into agrarian societies, and eventually, we've come to this point where we're financialized and digitized societies. And alongside that trend of complexity is a trend of a sense of power that has become increasingly authoritarian, and that has kind of encouraged this slow separation of ourselves from ourselves. And that's what I think we're talking about today when we're talking about dismantling, because I think that over thousands of years of now, increasingly complex human societies where there's more of us, and we've kind of had to come up with, what Brenton was talking about, these intersubjective phenomena that regulate our lives, that's become increasingly complex. But the undertone of that has been something that's kind of detached us from our own depths. And with that detachment from our own depths, we are the basis of the societies and the institutions, and we collectively make up the values that we aspire to in leadership. So I think what we're seeing is just an emulation of that on in all kind of parts of our lives. And so sometimes I guess when we're talking about dismantling and what that means today, I think we really have to talk about the boundaries around us. And for me, as somebody who's a migrant, a refugee, and who's kind of been outside the margins, I guess, those boundaries to me are very visible. And that's the work I've chosen to steep myself in. But I think we need a broader conscientization of those boundaries existing. And trust really fits into that as well. Because if we've kind of got these institutions that have been developed on this notion of power that is centralized and authoritarian, then we find ourselves increasingly unable to trust the people that are charged with governing us, and or the institutions that we rely on for to function in society, like our banks and the education system, this kind of thing. So I think we have a lot of trust to rebuild, and for me that comes down to a dismantling of boundaries. And those boundaries begin with ideology, so they begin with our beliefs, what we believe about ourselves, and who we want to be collectively, but then they manifest in physical realities as well.
I mean, I think that's just reminds me of an article I was reading around looking at why the current situation is so dangerous for feminism. I think they were saying, but they were looking at sort of cases of Ebola and the family structures, which when we don't dismantle that power structure, we kind of revert back to what was, essentially. And so often they were finding that who's going to homeschool? Is that going, if you're in a heterosexual relationship, does the woman end up being the person who's then responsible for homeschooling, which then further cements the man's role as the single breadwinner again? Or reminded of the Malaysian recommendation for the head of the household to be the one that does the grocery shopping. And there are these challenges and assumptions that we thought maybe we were growing out of, and maybe we're not. And how do we also dismantle those practices and those old ways of organising and those old power structures to be able to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in a future which is further exasperating social inequity.
Yeah, absolutely, Kristen. I think that is so important, because I think what is happening, I guess, in a less generalized sense in terms of what we're dealing with now with this global pandemic, is that it is actually really making visible the things that we could either ignore for a really long time, or think didn't affect us, or maybe weren't even conscious of. And absolutely, there's going to be questions that are raised immediately around feminism and whether we've outgrown patriarchal gender roles, or all sorts of things, like bigger questions about how quickly we can, governments might make decisions around metadata and surveillance, things that will stay with us for maybe years to come, even after this pandemic. So I think what's going to happen is it's going to raise all these things, things that were maybe hidden for a really long time. And I think we will collectively be charged with the long-term the long-term approach we want to take to these things. So that's why I think it's really, really important to ask these questions now about the basis of the power, the basis of the ideas of leadership that regulate us. I really do think that, we can't really, I've heard people speaking about, returning to normal. And I don't think returning to normal is good enough. I think we have an opportunity to start to see the faults and flaws of the kinds of dehumanization that normalized and to begin to dream bigger than that. And I really do think it starts with being able to conscientize, verbalize a shift in our collective consciousness of what we value and what we perceive power to be.
Yeah, which comes back to what Brenton was saying around the noticing, as well. If you can't stop and describe what you're seeing, it's hard to then consciously, move ourselves into a different way. And there's a comment here on the chat from Steve Cork, who says, "We are all channeling the future we hope is emerging. Let's be vigilant that something else could be happening," which I just think is a perfect kind of statement of the leadership that we need, that vigilance and the alertness to the new.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just thinking, Durkhanai, because there's one other thing I wanted to ask you as we round out this chapter on dismantling, is just this, I mentioned Shoshana Zuboff's surveillance capitalism, and this notion of Stephen's word vigilance, and how that tension between vigilance and surveillance, and how there are strong tensions that I think, because I'm very curious about the work you're doing with Atlantic Fellows, and as they do advance fairer, healthier and more inclusive societies. So I think, what is a leadership lesson or perhaps inspiration we can take around this notion of vigilance and relationship with surveillance? I'm curious to hear from you on that, Durkhanai.
Thanks, Matt. Well, I think that, it's really, I'm going to bring it back to another of Shoshana Zuboff's points that you mentioned earlier, which is unprecedented. So I think we're at this stage now where we cannot fall into the trap of thinking that what we're facing now is something we've seen before. But at the same time, I think it will be a balance, because there are elements of what we are confronting today as a society that we have seen before. We've collectively gone through the Spanish flu or the bubonic plague, for example. And then also, I think it's really important to stop and honour the fact that localised communities have been through this before. Entire Indigenous communities have been eradicated because of European colonization processes throughout history. So there are definitely lessons we can learn from that. But I think we need to be able to apply that with the concept of unprecedented, of not assuming that we know, of having the intellectual humility to understand that multiple possibilities exist. And I think we need to kind of start to meditate on that tension between human agency and control, and the parts that maybe we cannot control. And that comes back to my kind of idea of, a shift in values of what we perceive power to be. And, it needs to be a version of power that is intent on dismantling boundaries, that isn't built on a theory of economic exclusion or social exclusion or cultural exclusion. So I really do believe that so much of this requires a fundamental shift of our ideologies and what we value as power. And then I think this concept that I heard the senior lecturer for poetry at Oxford in a beautiful speech, she has this concept called trans-shifting. So you shift one fundamental thing, and then the challenges you face are no longer the same because you've shifted something fundamental, and we've all trans-shifted, and we're going to start to see different things emerge. And hopefully they're things that are built on the concept of dismantling the boundaries around us.
That's beautifully summarised, Durkhanai, and please do share links later on to those particular statements. So we're going along great, and thank you, Kristen, for bringing in comments and questions from the chat. And I think that we've covered quite a lot of ground around sort of opening this up and looking at those structures. So the discombobulation and then the dismantling, excuse me. Now I think I want to introduce someone to you who does something with hope that I think is really interesting.
So before we get to hope though, Matthew, can I just, there are a couple of comments that I think I just wanted to leave as kind of questions for us, because I think what Durkhanai was talking about was being willing to dismantle the things that aren't working and being open to, and who aren't, or I guess those things that may be working for some of us but not for all of us. I guess that's our other challenge. But the comments are things like, right now, Jacob Whitlock said, right now we are confined within physical boundaries, but digitally globalized and mobile. So how do we reconcile those different types of boundaries where one is being kind of shut off to us and the other one is being opened up? A comment from Madeline Dove that says, I worry that by challenging existing boundaries, that those boundaries can then be reappropriated by other existing powers. So do media institutions then start to take charge of some of the boundaries that are being dismantled, or how do you imagine, I guess, that dismantling a boundary in one bit doesn't mean it won't be built by something else in a way that we don't like. So I think that tension is really interesting. Catherine Anderson's asked, will we see a deglobalization? So I think all of these things around what are we dismantling and how do we protect the things that are important, and how do we ensure that by dismantling something we don't make way for something that is even less useful in the rebuilding of it? I think are all really, really great open questions that might then lead on to our next speaker as well.
It's fantastic, and all of the uncertainty and the flux that we're experiencing with things that are familiar, sort of dissolving, to use Durkhani's word, in front of us, that path that we thought we had planned. There are some really deep reflections to consider around that, and I think the whole idea of leadership, and Durkhani mentioning Joseph Campbell and his particular model around leadership, which I think is really worth exploring. It really does throw all of that out for consideration, and the notion of nation states and our relationship globally, the familiarity that connects us, that might be another boundary that we're blurring. It's extraordinary stuff to consider.
And look, I think at the start, Brenton talked about the grief of kind of seeing a year's worth of plans sort of disappear, or that type of thing, and Durkhani's talking about dismantling as well, and there is a grief that will go with those things that we had previously held precious, that no longer function so well for us. And I think that does require a new, or maybe not a new, but certainly a stronger aspect to a leadership skill that maybe we didn't privilege before in leadership. The ability to let go, and to honour that for people, and to recognise that loss is not something that I think a lot of us who are in leadership roles necessarily do particularly well, because we're often so focused on the thing we want to change, or the new thing we want to bring into being. And it just strikes me that some of this does require us to act differently, to purposefully acknowledge those things that are no longer useful, so that they can be dismantled productively.
Yeah, and I know that you're a practitioner really in adaptive leadership, and that ability to take multiple perspectives simultaneously, with a problem, with a system, is work that I think we all need to do in our leadership. And a lot of the narratives or models that were familiar, that are clearly not going to help us with what's next, they need to be contested and reconsidered.